Welcome to this special edition of the Jewish Diaspora Report. On this special episode, we talk about how all eyes are on bullshit. Let's get started. Welcome to this, we'll call it a bonus episode. Normally I don't do this many podcasts per week, but I feel like this week unfortunately requires one to give a little bit more background on what's going on right now. As many of my listeners probably know by now, if they're on social media of any kind, there's been this massive, unfortunate situation that's been going on. We're going to go over some of the facts of what we know and what we don't know, and also look into how this unfortunate incident has turned into a massive anti-Semitic attack against the Jewish people all over the world. For anybody who follows our podcasts somewhat regularly, this whole anti-Semitism rise in the world is probably not new to you, as well as the whole issue in Gaza. We've talked about Raffah and the situation a few times on this podcast. But this past week, unfortunately, a very big incident happened, which we are all saddened by. The initial reports came out with some videos of huge amounts of fire and the claims from people online that Israel had struck a civilian area in Raffah, and many people were harmed, people were killed. And the first time I heard this, before even seeing any of the pictures, one of our followers had messaged me and said, "What's the deal with this?" and sent me a link to some type of crazy post online, pro-Palestinian, anti-Israel post, saying that Israeli strike in Raffah beheads and burns babies alive. And at first, without even knowing really the context, I hadn't heard about the strike yet, I knew it was fake. I'll tell you why. I've said this many, many times to people in my orbit. I've never said it on this podcast, I don't think, but it's very interesting to look at. Whenever you find any kind of information coming out about Hamas and things they've done and things they're currently doing, you will find almost exactly 24 hours or even less later the exact same thing that Hamas is being accused of by reports, media, witnesses, hostages who are released. You're going to hear the exact same thing said about Israel. I'll give you an example. When the first round of hostages were released out of Gaza, and they were traded for prisoners, if you recall, this was quite a few months ago, initial reports were coming out about hostages complaining about horrible conditions and being beaten and harmed. And many people remember Mia, one of the hostages, with her broken arm. Reports were coming out frantically about the terrible treatment by Hamas. And within 24 hours, we were seeing on the anti-Israel social media reports of supposedly these prisoners and terrorists who were being released, being terribly treated in jails by the Israelis. It was practically word for word what was going on from the hostages now coming out on social media about Israel and the prisoners that were being released. They even went so far as to have a young man who was released from prison with casts on both his arms, as if both arms up to the shoulder were broken, with the report of apparently terrible abuse, that this poor little young man's arms were broken and they were treated so badly in prison. This came out the next day, and the world went crazy. Except when eventually a video surfaced of the actual release of these prisoners, and that young man had no casts on his arms and actually used his arms to sign himself out or wave goodbye. I can't remember, it's been a while, but his arms were very much mobile and not broken. This is the kind of thing I'm talking about when I say that whenever something happens, they just say it happened the other way around. We saw this again, also, if you recall. Eventually, the hostages were released, and we started hearing about the rape claims in the unfortunate situations that these hostages were kept in. People were coming out about watching and witnessing it happening to them, things of that nature. And sure enough, within 24 hours, if you remember, reports from Gaza were coming out that, I'll leave it to you, can you guess? Israeli soldiers raping Gazan women. And all kinds of reports were coming out how Israelis are raping women. Almost identical word for word. They don't even pretend to change any of the words. I don't know if they're intending to troll the West by literally turning the one situation around and just replacing the word Hamas with Israel and thinking, hey, this is funny, watch them suck this down and not even say anything about it, even though this is literally the opposite of what actually happened. Sure enough, not long later, even Al Jazeera, who reported the rapes, had to retract the statement claiming that the woman who said it was lying, and it never happened. My personal opinion as to why this happens is either A, because they want to change the subject, so Hamas gets found out for raping women in captivity, and we then say Israel rapes people, so therefore maybe everyone will stop talking about us raping people. They'll all talk about Israel raping people, even if it's not true, even if it comes out 6 weeks later. By then, the damage has already been done. People think Israel did it. No problem. They're out of the woods. The other option I think might be is that even if people remember that Hamas raped people, the fact that now they've painted Israel as supposed rapists as well, it allows those people who usually have an issue with rape and murder and beheading children and all these little things, it allows them to go, well, it seems like it's kind of happening on both sides here. Israel's doing it and Hamas is doing it, so they're kind of even. So therefore, I'll support Hamas because, there are other issues that I like about what Hamas is doing, the whole resistance thing. Whereas Israel, I don't like what they do. And sadly, it seems to work. And this week is perfect proof of that. The initial reports coming out from Raffah this week was that babies in this Israeli strike were, quote, beheaded and burned alive. Now, maybe this sounds familiar to many of you because it's literally what happened on October 7th that everyone tried to pretend didn't happen, but we all know happened. Isn't it really coincidental? Like I said, it seems like they're trolling to use the exact same phraseology. Beheaded and burned alive. That's literally what they did and what Israelis have been saying forever. So my first thoughts when I saw this, of course, was to tell the follower, this is obviously fake, because what are the chances that the exact same thing happened to the Israelis and now Hamas is turning it around? And then I saw the supposed strike footage coming out. And the funny thing was, at first, of course, it looks terrible. Don't get me wrong. It's a brutal sight. However, I made a point to that follower. I don't understand. This is common sense here. I'm not a doctor. I don't pretend to be a doctor. But how does a bomb, a massive explosion, behead something? It makes no common sense. I spoke to doctor friends of mine. It's literally impossible. Unless somehow the blast was only focused directly on the neck in order to make the head disappear. It's impossible to behead something with an explosion. So let's keep that in mind. Don't get me wrong, an explosion will do great damage to an entire body of any size, but to behead doesn't make any sense. It's literally impossible. So again, are they trolling, or do they know that their followers are just really, really, really dumb to not understand common sense here? You could say people were harmed. Sure, I can accept that. And we know it did happen. But to be beheaded is just literal fiction. So of course, initially, the internet ran wild with Israel did this strike. And unfortunately, or fortunately, we'll discuss that, Israel came out almost immediately with an apology saying that it must have been an accident. This was a mistake. It shouldn't have happened. And we are sorry and we're investigating. Which, on the one hand, is what you would expect from a country who's fighting a moral war. On the other hand, it kind of lent itself to the unfortunate reality that people will use this as ammo, that Israel is admitting to doing something wrong, that they admit to killing innocent civilians. And at that point, typical, they have to investigate. Unlike Hamas, who can just literally make up stories, 45 killed, all babies, all women, no men around, beheaded, would they just make it up? They don't even have to go to the site. They literally just get a phone call from their friend and say, hey, look what happened. And they go, okay, 15 killed, all babies. They don't have to actually investigate. Whereas Israel actually has to investigate. So Israel's been doing a much better job of getting the information out, but there is a delay. And then, despite the uproar among social media activists saying that there was this massacre of babies in Raffah, by the way, they say specifically in a humanitarian zone in Raffah, slowly videos started coming out from people in Gaza at the site of the bombing. And amazingly, in Arabic, I don't think they did this on purpose. I think it was just caught by accident and people found it and started to spread the facts and the truth. Someone in Gaza, in Arabic, was saying, hey, what happened here? And another guy said, oh, it looks like Israel struck a Jeep. And the guy said, oh, Israeli struck a Jeep? Whose Jeep? Because obviously it's Hamas's Jeep and it must have been full of rockets. We need to get out of here because all these rockets are currently exploding from the explosion that was caused by the Israelis. So that was the first little chink in the armor of this story they have created about the beheaded babies and burnt alive and all that other BS because Israelis struck a mistaken target. Slowly, shortly after that, Israel did come out with facts, with video, with information about exactly what happened. They have video watching surveillance on a warehouse that is being used at that time by Hamas terrorists, which is not in a humanitarian zone. However, to be fair, 1 kilometer or so away from a humanitarian zone. And unfortunately, they decide to put all of their people right next to a big area filled with tents and refugees. It's not surprising to us. We've seen them do this many times. That is their human shield defense system. We have Iron Dome. They have human shields. So Israel comes out with the facts, which is that it wasn't in a safe area. It was outside of a safe zone. It was an area that they knew that there were only Hamas people there. It was a warehouse filled with Hamas terrorists meeting. And when they hit this warehouse with what they say, and apparently this was confirmed by the Americans, the smallest sized warhead available to jets. It had the smallest explosive and it would not cause what ended up happening on the ground there. And so Israel realized in the video footage, which you can see by yourself, by the way, you could see that the explosion hits, it's a small fire, and then all of a sudden you see secondary and third and fourth explosions, which is the rockets that were inside that warehouse and in that Jeep started to explode. Now this makes essentially perfect sense considering the facts on the ground. The explosion was way too big for what Israel had used, and it's corroborated by the videos we saw of the Gazans seeing the explosion and saying that it blew up apparently a Hamas Jeep filled with rockets. Now another way we can corroborate this, because of course it's always good to corroborate, is the fact that the day before this happened, the city of Tel Aviv was shot at with rockets from Raffah. So therefore, we know, obviously, that Hamas still has rockets because they just shot them, and common sense would suggest that they would have to refill their rocket launchers in Raffah. So therefore, it's not that outrageous to think that A, there's a storage site in Raffah filled with rockets, and B, maybe that Jeep was either delivering or coming back from, with extra rockets, that area that they were refilling their rocket launchers. It makes sense for their next attack on Tel Aviv that everyone will, of course, ignore. So after crazy amounts of lies that are going around about beheaded babies and all this other stuff, it turns out that Israel hit a legitimate, righteous target. There were no people around that area with that size of a warhead. However, Hamas, using their people as human shields, decided to use a warehouse in a close to a safe area and fill it with rockets. And Israel had no idea they were there, and it exploded. And then it ended up legitimately hurting innocent people because those rockets were exploding and those rockets may have shot off, and it probably hurt a lot of people. So here we have this conundrum. Is it Israel's fault? Is it not Israel's fault? Is it Hamas's fault? Personally, I believe Israel did the best they could, but yes, they have some slight responsibility for unfortunately setting off this chain reaction. Slight. Unfortunately, this is a war and it happens. I would say the bigger responsibility is Hamas. Hamas decided to use a civilian area to store and stockpile highly explosive materials next to people in hopes that Israel will not hit that area. Oh, it's only 1 kilometer away from a safe zone. We'll lie and say it was a safe zone, so we're good. They're not going to hit us because Israel would never try and hit this close to a safe area. They move stuff on purpose into this safe area. Let me remind you, it's only been about 3 or 4 weeks that safe area has even existed. So they, in the last few weeks, have actually moved things to that area on purpose with the displaced people. So as much as Israel at first admitted it was a mistake, it really wasn't exactly a mistake. Unfortunately, it was a miscalculation with the fact that there were rockets inside. And I'm sure if Israel knew then what they know now in regards to the rockets, they probably would not have hit that target. But we've seen this before too. We saw not long ago with that whole World Kitchen charity that the people got killed and the world came out against Israel. Even the head of the World Kitchen came out and said Israel targeted them on purpose. We saw this lie before. The lie is, in that case, what ended up happening was that Hamas baited Israel into attacking these charity workers by essentially, what it came out eventually, is that they were kidnapped, they were held, The terrorist Hamas people shot at a drone in order to get its attention. And then when they struck that car, Israel had no idea it was charity workers because that same car had Hamas fighters in it moments before. And there's video to show this. You could literally watch the Hamas fighters shooting, them getting in the car, driving to a warehouse where they quickly get out of the car and let the charity people continue on the road, where they're eventually shot and killed by the Israelis. It seems like common sense. Like that would be a normal reaction. You're shot at by a car in a war zone and you would take the car out. Little did Israel know that Hamas had set them up to get world sympathy by making Israel look like the bad guy. Meanwhile, they sacrificed people who actually were helping the Gazan people. They care nothing about these Western charity workers. You are just propaganda for us to use and kill so that way we can hate on Israel. You mean nothing to us. So are we that surprised that Hamas then stores rockets next to its people? Maybe even in hopes that Israel will hit it so they can blame them for hitting a safe zone. Because to Hamas, all that really matters is the PR. And I hate to say they are winning. I am sure there's not one person listening to this podcast who hasn't seen at least once on social media this whole eyes on Raffah BS. It is literally propaganda created by Hamas and their supporters to get the world on their side. And it is unreal how much it's actually being spread. It is a complete fiction and lie that they created in order to make the world feel bad. First of all, that strike wasn't even in Raffah. It was near the safe zone, which is nowhere near Raffah. And yet, eyes on Raffah. It has nothing to do with it. And just like every other time, it is unbelievable that Israel comes out with the facts, the truth, the videos, everything to prove what they're saying. Even the United States has come out and agreed that the warhead that they used would never have caused that explosion. And nothing. You hear silence. Nobody cares what Israel has to say. Israel could literally show you that exact thing on video, and it's never good enough. Because people, unfortunately, just don't believe Israel, and no matter what, for some crazy reason, only accept the word of Hamas. It makes literally no sense. I am all for questioning my sources. I question sources all the time, despite what people say about me on social media. But I just can never understand why people will accept Hamas at its face value, no questions about common sense, about the possibility that maybe they're not telling the truth. They are a terrorist organization after all. You have video showing from Gazans saying that it was Hamas's warehouse that was hit and that it's rockets going off. And that's just never enough. Israel can never tell the truth and Hamas can never tell a lie, according to these people. The PR that Hamas does is something that's going to be studied in future years. Terrorist groups or marketing companies, someone's got to figure out how in the world you can get people to spread lies within seconds. That eyes on Raffah bullshit has been around the world millions and millions and millions of times already, and people are just eating it up. They should definitely teach a class on how to market lies, because honestly, they are above anybody else in the entire world. Part of me just assumes at this point that the reason why it works so well and it doesn't work for anybody else is because of anti-Semitism. And I hate to use that word. You know, everyone says the Jews throw around anti-Semitism any chance they get. But it really is the only excuse to why people will blindly follow Hamas. And they don't blindly follow Russia or Ukraine. When North Korea sends out information, no one goes, oh, it must be true. Only with Hamas and only anti-Israel sources somehow get taken as gold. Because to these people who are clearly anti-Semitic, Israel can never tell the truth. Nothing they say is truthful. Everything is a lie. That's because they believe the Jews are terrible. The Jews control the world. The Jews are about genocide and massacre. All of these lies that they believe make it so easy for them. Sure, that makes sense. The Jews killing people? Sure, I believe that. The Jews are terrible. I heard that my whole life, or it makes sense to me. And this has gotten so bad. Aside from the anti-Semitism we see normally around the world, we actually see the escalation. Like today, the specific issue of Raffah came up in Mexico when the Israeli embassy in Mexico was stormed and set on fire because of quote unquote a rally for Raffah. These people are out of control, and they are using these Hamas PR calls to action against Israel and every Jew. When you hear all eyes on Raffah, maybe you should ask where everybody's eyes have been for the last number of months when those hostages were sitting in Raffah. Where are all eyes on Raffah when Hamas was planning the October 7th attack? Honestly, I really am out of words. I don't know what else to say. I had one of our followers message me, who's not even Jewish, has no connection to Israel at all, and said to me, I feel so alone and so isolated, and I don't know what to do. I feel like I'm screaming into the wind. And I'll be honest, I told her I feel that all the time. It's kind of why I started this podcast. So instead of screaming into the wind, I scream into this microphone. Sorry if I'm too loud sometimes. But the reality is, all of us are feeling alone because it seems like everybody in the world is just waiting and begging for an excuse and a reason to hate the Jews. No matter what happens in reality and what can be proven beyond any reasonable doubt with video evidence and people on the ground saying what they're seeing, people don't want to believe it. They just want to hate the Jews. And this all eyes on Raffah movement that has started right now on social media is purposefully trying to use this moment that ironically was started by Hamas, which is what the Israelis have been saying forever. Let's get rid of Hamas and people won't die. Because the reality is that's literally who killed these people. And yet they're using it against the Jews as an excuse to hate and kill and attack Jews all over the world. And I'm honestly quite sick of it.